Hi everyone, welcome to this new video guide for Project Zomboid. In this video we're going to tackle quite a complicated subject, which is the Lua and Java interface, or what we more commonly call the Lua API. This is kind of a technical subject, and so it might get complicated at some point. I'm going to go with the assumption that you know how Lua as a language is written, what it looks like, the basics of it, like the type of variables, these kind of things, how you write functions, code with it. For the Java, I'm not asking too much from you to start to watch this video. I'm simply going to explain the basics of it, the very basics of it that you need to know about to understand the Lua API. For the Lua, you can go in the Lua language page to learn more about it and how it works. I suggest you do that first before watching this video. The Lua API page is going to teach the basics of the Project Zomboid Lua-Java interface. It's going to serve as a base for this presentation. In terms of documentations, you have the Lua event page, the JavaDocs, and the LuaDocs that are going to be useful, and that we will discuss a bit later. I also want to thank Albion for feedback on this slide and on the video. So to start off, you have the Lua, which has an interface with the Java. Both can communicate together, so the Java can call stuff in the Lua, and the Lua can call stuff in the Java. To start very rough, this is basically what it looks like to start off. So the Lua itself doesn't know about the Java. The Java has a bunch of classes that are defined. So for example, you have the ISO player class, ISO zombie class, which are respectively the player and the zombie class. You have an inventory item, the climate manager, and other kind of stuff. These classes are exposed to the Lua by the means of the Lua manager. This Lua manager is a class itself, which contains two nested classes, which are the exposer and the global object. The exposer takes stuff that we give it, so like for example a class, and it will expose this class to the Lua that we are going to discuss a bit further. This exposer is also going to take global objects that are defined in the nested class global object. Those are basically functions. So for example, get puddles manager, get all animals definitions. All of these are going to be global functions that you can run on the Lua to access different elements and to start accessing various things. So in this case, the puddles, animal definitions, to check if the game is currently in demo mode and to get mods and a bunch of other global functions. So this nested class defines those functions, and the exposer takes the global object class and functions and exposes it to the Lua. So on the Lua parts, we get access to these things, and these are defined in the globals of the Lua, which is more specifically stored in the underscore G table. This is very specific technical Lua stuff that you don't need to know about. But this is going to expose those things into equivalent classes and functions as Lua implementations. So what this allows you, the Lua and Java to do, is direct references to classes from the Java to the Lua. And the same thing for the Java, it can access Lua stuff defined in it and call different functions. Some classes are exposed while some aren't. So in this case, these are classes that are exposed, but you might have classes in the Java that are not available in the Lua. If a class isn't exposed, you can't do anything with it. And if a class is exposed, you can call its public methods. We're going to discuss more in detail about this later. Okay, so this is an example of communication between the Lua and the Java with a simple code that we're going to show in the next slide after this one. So you have in the globals a getCell function, which was defined in the Lua Manager global object nested class. When you call it from the Lua, it's going to call the getCell function in the nested class global object of the Lua Manager. In the Java side, this function, it's going to return an isocell instance. This isocell instance is returned to the Lua, which you can write in a variable to cache, for example. And this is going to have a direct reference with the Java isocell instance. This isocell instance, it's a class in itself, and it can have functions. So in this case, the Java has a function which is getZombieList. And since isocell is also exposed, the Lua can call things that are in the isocell. So in this case, it can call the function getZombieList. When you call the getZombieList from the Lua side, it's actually going to call the getZombieList from the Java side. And this same like getZombieList, it's the same thing as getCell. It can return an array list of isogame characters, and it's going to return this same thing to the Lua, which is a direct reference to the array list in the Java. So what does this look like in a code equivalent? So you have local cell, it's called getCell. This is going to call the first function that we discussed about. This is stored in the global, so as you can see, this is directly called as a global function. This getCell is going to call this part of the code in the Java side. This function, getCell, is a public static function, and it's going to return an isocell instance. So in this case, it gets it this way, but this isn't important in this case. We're not going to focus on the details of the code. This cell, so it's an isocell instance, and this isocell instance can call a getZombieList function. This getZombieList function is this one defined here, and it's a public function which returns an array list of isozombie, which returns exactly what we want. We store the result in a zombies variable, and we can also call this thing in a one-line version by simply doing getCell and directly call getZombieList in it. The only difference is that we're not storing getCell in a variable, so we're not caching it. In most cases, you probably want to do this for performance reasons. So what do we get at the end? Well, we basically get in zombies, the zombies variable, directly this array list isozombie. This, the cell is a direct reference to the isocell instance, and the zombies is direct reference to the array list isozombie instance. So to better understand the Lua API, you need to understand the basics of the Java. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. So when you define a class in Java, basically the whole language depends on these classes. And when you define a class, in this example, class 1, this class 1 is going to implement methods, fields that you can access, and you can create a subclass to this class 1. In this case, we're going to call class 2, and this class 2 is going to implement every public methods and fields that are available in class 1. The class 1 is considered the parent class of class 2. And you can have as many of these as you want. So in this case, it's the isozombie hierarchy that we are defining. So isozombie is a subclass of isogame character, and isogame character has a parent class, which is isomoving object, which has a parent class, which is isoobject, game entity, and object, and so on. You can also have multiple subclasses to an existing class. So you could have easily a class 3, which extends class 1. You also have the concept of nested classes. We actually saw an example of that earlier in this video guide with the form of the Lua Manager. If you remember, I mentioned that the Lua Manager has an exposer nested class and a global object nested class. This nested class actually has access to anything which is private in its parent class, the class 1. The class 2 here in this case, which is a subclass of class 1, doesn't have access to private stuff in the class 1. The class 1.1 and 1.2, they do, however. So in this case, you have the Lua manager, which is a subclass of the object class. And this Lua manager class has two nested classes, which are the exposer and the global object. And these have access to everything which is defined in the Lua manager. This isn't a very important concept to remember. It's not something you're going to see often in the Lua API, and you usually don't really care about it. It's sometimes used for enumerators and stuff like that, but in this case, we're not going to discuss this more in depth. Your methods and fields are actually defined in specific ways. So there are different properties that will define how they can interact with stuff around them in a way. You have the concept of private and public fields. This is something I mentioned quite a few times now in this guide. Basically, a private method can be accessed only inside this class. You can't access it from subclasses or parent classes, but a nested class can access it, while a public method can be accessed from anywhere. And it's also going to be exposed thanks to the exposer if the class is exposed. If it's private, the method is not accessible from the Lua at all. You have static and instance. What this means is that you can have static methods or instant methods. A static method can be called directly from the class 1, while an instance method is actually dependent on an instance of this class to be run. You have methods and fields. This is also something mentioned quite a few times now. A method is simply a function, while a field, in this case this value, is going to hold a specific value that can be accessed either from the instance or the class itself. And when you combine everything, you get the class 1, which has a method do that, in this case, which is a private static method. So it means that it's only accessible from inside this class, and it actually doesn't require an instance to be run. You have the do this method, which is public and an instance method. So it can be called from anywhere and is exposed to the Lua if the class 1 is exposed to the Lua. And it can be called, and it needs an instance to be called. Then you have the field values. You can have public, private, and also static is also available for those. In this case, we're not going to discuss too much about them, but simply you can't access them that easily in the Lua. You need to use some tricks to access them most of the time. In code, this is how the class 1 will be written. So the class 1 is actually a public. In this class 1, you have a private static method do that, which returns, in this case, a return object, which is simply an example. You have the public method, the public field, and private field. So what impact does the static and instance have on the Lua? Here we have the Java class from previously, or example from previously class 1, with the various methods and fields that are accessible. And we also have some extra bits to be able to showcase how this impacts our code in the Lua. We can retrieve the instance of this class via the use of a public static method called getInstance, which is going to return the instance field, which is a public static, and it's simply a class 1 instance. We assume our class 1 is exposed to the Lua, so it can be directly accessed from the Lua environment. And we retrieve the instance by calling class1 dot getInstance. This is going to store the class 1 instance inside the local instance variable. And from this, we can run various functions that are exposed. So we can run a public function by doing instance semicolon do this. This is simply going to run or do this here function, which is a public instance function, which returns an object. Notice here the semicolon. This is a bit different from the dot called previously. The semicolon here is necessary when you call an instance method, because it's going to pass the instance to this method to run on. When you want to run a public static function, however, you need to use a dot this time. So you can do instance.do.dot, or you can directly do class1.do.dot. This is exactly the same thing as a getInstance method here. It's a public static method, same as the do.dot method, which is a public static here. If you want to run a private function, well, we said we can't do that. It's a private method, and this method is only accessible to the class itself. It can only be called from inside itself. So if you try to do that, it's actually going to throw an error. For advanced users, you can also call a public function this way, with the semicolon, by doing instance.doThisInstance. This might remind you of how the Lua class stuff works, but we're not going to go in depth on how this works. Okay, so what do we do from here? Well, we know how to run the classes and methods, but how do we actually know what method and classes are available? Well, for the Java, you have access to the JavaDocs. This is going to list every public methods and fields which are available in a class, and it's basically what's available to you for the most part in the Lua environment. You can also decompile the game code. I've made a video about this subject if you want to check it out, and it allows you to directly access the Java code. For the Lua, you have access to the LuaDocs. It's used to list the Lua events, and it's also going to list the various functions that are available in the Lua and the various pseudo classes that are available. You can also search the game files. I'm going to show that a bit later too. So first off, I'm going to show you what the JavaDocs looks like. So in the modding wiki, we're going to search for the JavaDocs. The JavaDocs there's 3 different ones available to you. You have the official Project Zomboid JavaDocs, which is for build 41.77. It's not available for the last version of build 41, but it's official, so it's got a few nice things to it. Then you have the unofficial JavaDocs for build 41. This is updated to build 41.78. And you have the unofficial JavaDocs for build 42, which is available for build 42 latest version. In this guide, I'm going to focus on build 42, so we're going to go in the JavaDocs of build 42. From here, you can access the JavaDocs from this link, and you will find this kind of page. Okay, so what's going on? Well, we're talking about packages. That's a concept I didn't present in this guide. It's not too important, but basically your classes are stored in these packages. What's going to interest us is a search tool here. Okay, so we presented to you a bit earlier some classes that are available in the game's code. So for example, the Lua manager, we can search for it, and we can open the detail of the Lua manager. Okay, so let's go step by step. Let's start from the top. You have the class called Lua manager here. It's a subclass of the object class, like we saw in the guide earlier, and it's a public final class that extends object. It has nested classes. These nested classes are the exposer class and the global object class, like we saw a bit earlier. The global object is going to hold all the global functions for the Lua, and the exposer is going to expose the classes to the Lua. From here, you have the fields available in this class, this way. You also have a constructor to make an instance of the Lua manager. And you have the method summary, which lists every methods available. So in this case, we're going to go in another class that's available. Let's search for IsoZombie, the zombie class. This is the one I presented a bit earlier in the guide too. So you have the IsoZombie class, which is a subclass of IsoGame character, IsoMoving object, etc., etc. It implements some interfaces. This is not too important in this case. You shouldn't focus too much on it. It also has nested classes. In this case, not too important either. You have fields, which are usually going to be some stats of the zombie. So for example, you have the cognition field, which is the cognition stat of the zombie instance, and you have some states of the zombie and a bunch of other stats. Now this is going to be quite an interesting thing. So since IsoZombie is actually a subclass of IsoGame character, it's going to inherit every public fields of IsoGame character. And in the same way, IsoGame character inherits the fields of IsoMoving object, of IsoObject, and game entity. So IsoZombie has access to all of these fields that were available in its parent class. For the method summary, you basically have the exact same thing. You have here the details of what the class returns. If it's void, it's basically nil in Lua, but it can return booleans, it can return other classes, floats, strings, and a bunch more of stuff. It also gives you the details of the parameters that you have to give to the methods. So for example, here dress in clothing item, it requires an item GUID, which is simply a string, but other classes may need more parameters. Take for example the it function, which needs a weapon, the wielder, the damage split, and more stuff. If we go further down, you can see that's a very long list of methods. These are the methods inherited from the IsoGame character. So like the fields previously, the IsoZombie actually inherits the IsoGame character methods that are public. And you can see this is quite a big list. In the same way, it inherits everything from IsoObject. So this was the JavaDocs. For the decompiled code, I'm simply going to show you what it looks like. For that, I'm going to open IDEA. So this is what you get. This is an interface which is a bit more detailed in my video guide for decompiling the game code. And you can see that you can check the various classes of the game. You have the IsoCell class that we saw in some of the examples I gave in the guide a bit earlier. You have some fields which are defined. Further down, you can have access to the various methods and what they do. This is a tool which is very useful and really needed when you start to do very technical stuff in the game, even from the Lua. So that's about it for the documentation on the Java side, and we're going to see a bit more on the Lua side of things. So let's see what the LuaDocs is. Again, we go on the Project Zomboid modding wiki, and we search for the LuaDocs. This is actually a project which doesn't have any official equivalent, and it's an attempt at documenting every available functions and classes in the Lua. You can access the LuaDoc from the website here, and you will find this page. On the left bar here, you have a list of things which are available. You have a direct link to the JavaDocs for build 42. You also have a list of events that we discussed a bit earlier, and we are going to discuss this a bit later in the guide too. You have a list of hooks, and you also have a list of classes which are available. These are usually the UI classes of the game or the timed actions of the game. You can go in a page of a class, so let's say for example is animal UI. You can see what it implements. You can see the public member functions. It's basically the same equivalent as the JavaDocs, but for the Lua. So you have the methods which are available, the parameters that they need, and you have more details about these. So that's about it for the LuaDocs. And now we're going to look at the most important thing you need to master. It's searching in the game files for things you're looking for. To do that, I'm going to open VS Code with the game files open in the media folder. Okay, so here I've got the media folder opened. as a workspace in VS Code. And in the media Lua folder, you can access the various codes of the game in the different folders, shared, server, and client. If we take a random file, for example, isLabel, you can check the functions, what isLabel extends. So in this case, it extends isUI element. And you can check the various functions of this class and what they do. But in Lua, not everything actually requires you to have a class, and usually you don't need any of that. Take, for example, the craft recipe code folder. It defines a bunch of global functions which are accessed from the scripts of the game to run specific things based on constructions, for example, in this case. Also have recipe-related code and a bunch more. And anytime you're looking for something, you need to learn how to search these game files. There's a specific wiki page on the subject, which you can access in the modding wiki, the game files page, and then the searching the game files section. In here, it's going to detail how you can look for things. So for example, in this case, we know the class function is takeFuel, and you can search in Visual Studio Code for where it actually appears. Let's say we want to find this exact class is takeFuel. You can do Control P. This is going to open a search tool for files. You can type is takeFuel, and you can find the file that defines exactly what you're looking for. But you can also see where is takeFuel is actually used by searching in the Lua folder this way. And you can see most of the time it's only called in 2 files, but you might get some search results that link to a lot more things based on what you're looking for. So that's about it on the available tools for the Lua and the Java. But there's one last very important tool, and it's the most important one because you need to run the code you're actually writing in the Lua. And this one is quite needed. These are the Lua events, which are used to trigger your code on specific events of the game. And you also have other methods of hooking to the game code, which are called decorations. But we're not going to discuss this. This is more of a technical thing. The Lua events has its own wiki page. So let's go there. Okay, so again, in the modding wiki, we can search for the Lua event page, this one. This is going to explain to you what Lua events are. But basically, whenever something triggers in the game, you can actually have a Lua event associated to it to trigger your specific Lua code at specific instance of the game. You can access the full list of events, like we mentioned previously in the LuaDocs, but you also have a Lua events category in the wiki itself, which lists every event. If we click a random one, for example, on player update, this is going to tell you which side this event is run. So if it's client or server side, or both. You have a description of what it does. So in this case, it's going to fire every tick for every player updates. It's going to return the parameters. So in this case, the player, which is an ISO player class. It also links to the JavaDocs in most cases. And you have examples of how you can hook to this code. So I'm going to show you a bit further when we're directly testing things in game on how you can use that to your advantage. Okay, welcome back. So we are inside VS Code with a workspace for a template mod, an example mod I just made. This example mod, if you need to know how to set up a mod with the mod.info files, I suggest you go watch my video on the mod structure guide. So this is the basic stuff you need to get a mod going with Lua stuff. You have the versioning folder for 42. I'm simply going to leave it here, but it could be 42.12 and more and other stuff. You need the media folder inside this and a Lua folder. In this Lua folder, you're not going to put your Lua scripts. You actually have a bit more to it. If we go in the wiki page for Lua, so in this case, Lua API, you have some detail about the folder structure in the section of the same name. The Lua scripts that you're going to create need to be put inside at least one subfolder, which is either client, server, or shared. These folders don't get fooled by their names. They are not actually only run in the client, server, and shared. You have here the details of which folder runs when, and basically everything runs every time, but the client folder doesn't run server-side for the multiplayer. So the server folder actually runs in multiplayer and single player too. You have a load order for these folders. So first off, the shared folder with the vanilla files loads, then the shared with mod files, then client with vanilla files, and finally the client with mod files. The server files are a bit more special because the server files are going to be loaded in only when you start a save, not when you start the game. So anything which is put inside server doesn't run until you start the save itself. Okay, so if we go back to VS Code now, let's create these subfolders for now. So how do you decide where you put your code? Well, it's a bit special. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're defining items, item distribution, usually this goes in server. So anything which needs to be run only when you load a save can go inside the server folder, but it's really not common, like there's no strict rules to it. It really depends on what you need. Usually, since shared is loaded first, you can put any tool functions inside the shared folder. So the server and client folders can access those. If you need code that runs in both server and client side, it's usually suggested to put it in shared and not in server, for example, and neither in client, because client doesn't actually run on the server side. In the client, you're usually going to put UIs, UI code, UI classes, since they only need to exist in the client side. In this case, since in build 42 multiplayer is not out yet, I'm not going to bother in this guide choosing the folder, and I'm simply going to put a script in shared. So I could simply do a new file this way and name it like that. But if I do that, you can see you have only the folder shared above. So you have media, Lua shared, and your script with quite a generic name. So this is going to be problematic if you try to run your mod with other mods that followed this guide and decided to do exactly that. Because if everyone does that, well, all your mods are going to clash together because the files are going to be named the same way at the same place. So you have two solutions to stop problems from coming with this kind of stuff. Either you give a specific name to your file, which is very unique. So let's say, for example, my very unique named mod, my mod1, I'm going to take that again and add it as a prefix to my script file. This way. This should fix most problems. But in reality, what you would want to do is keep your script file this way if you want. You do whatever you want, but you create a subfolder inside your shared folder, which is going to be my mod1, and you put your script inside it. What this means is that your files inside my mod1 will only clash with mods that are named the exact same way as yours, if they even use such a subfolder, and if they named it the same way. In most cases, this is not going to cause any problems. But be careful if your mod has a very generic name. So let's say, for example, your mod is named Animal. This is going to be very problematic because maybe other mods can be called Animal. This is too generic of a name. So make sure to have a very unique name for your folder. It could simply be your username, you know. So in this area, I could have animal sin kdt, and this would be enough in most cases. In this case, I'm going to name it my mod 1. We're going to assume this is unique enough in this case. And you can do that for server too, if you ever put any Lua files in it, and clients. In this case, it's not too important because we're not going to work from the client and server folders. We're going to work from the shared folders. Okay, so we've got our script Lua file here. For now, it's empty. We could simply put our code in this file. So for example, this way. But the problem is that, like we saw in the Lua page, in the Lua wiki page, the shared and client folders are going to load instantly when we launch the game, and the server folder is going to launch when we launch a save. So what this means is that our code here is going to run instantly when the game launches. But depending on what we're trying to do, this might not be exactly what we want to do. So in this case, like doing print hello world might be enough for a simple print in the console when the game starts, but we really don't want to do that. So let's take the example of the slides from before that I've shown you, where we want to access the cell by doing cat cell this way, and we want to access the zombie list by doing cell gets zombie list. Okay, but you can see some problem here. First off, if we run this, it's going to run when we launch a save. So like we said, we don't want to do that. But more importantly, you're seeing it showing an error, undefined global get cell. You might not get this highlighted text here. You simply need to put your cursor on the error and it's going to tell you what's wrong. So what does this mean? Well, the Lua environment we're coding in is not aware of what undefined global get cell is. And it's simply because this is very specific to Project Zomboid and it's not a generic Lua thing. So how do we tell that all VS Code that this is actually a thing in what we are coding? Well, we want to use a language server pack. So to do that, you need to download the Lua language server pack. In my case, I already have it installed. So you want to install this one from Subnico. This is called LuaLs. Maybe later you actually might want to install EmmyLua instead. For now, this is going to be Lua from Subnico. But this is not doing everything we want, but this extension is doing something very cool because it's actually making you it's actually rendering something available to you, which is called the add-on manager. So you want to open this menu by doing Ctrl-Shift-P and then searching for add-on, and you should find this option to select. So what is this? Well, all of these are simply add-ons simply Lua typing packs for your Lua environment to activate. In this case, we're going to be interested in the umbrella add-on package. If we go in the wiki and we search for umbrella modding, you will find more details on what this is, but it's simply an add-on made for VS Code and for LuaLs, and probably going to be for EmmyLua later down the line. So make sure that you check this page for more details of what it uses. And how do you actually activate it? Well, we did Ctrl-Shift-P, like expected, open the add-on manager, and we need to look for umbrella. So if we search for umbrella here, we have two versions, the unstable one and umbrella, the classic ones. This umbrella version, the classic one, is for build 41, and the umbrella unstable is going to be for build 42, based on whenever build 42 is the unstable or stable version when you're watching this video. So in this case, we want to activate the umbrella unstable. At least in my case, I'm doing this guide when it's in unstable. Let's wait for the whole workspace to reload. And you can see I don't have any error anymore. If we put our cursor on getCell, it's going to tell you that it's a function that returns isocell. So it's exactly what we want. And what this means is that the extension is smart enough to know that getCell returns an isocell, and you're writing that to the cell variable here. So if you put your cursor on it, it's going to show you that it's an isocell instance. And this isocell holds a bunch of stuff. And if we put our cursor on the getZombie list, which we're running for the cell here, you can have some details of what it does. So it returns an array list, and it's a list of every zombies currently in the world. So in this case, the zombies variable is going to be our array list of isozombies, and we can do a bunch more stuff on this. Okay, so the next step now is to run this code at a time where we're interested to do it. So in this example, I'm going to use this code to show a text above every zombies, which is simply going to be an hello world string. So to do that, we want to hook something. In my case, I'm going to use a keybind. To hook to a keybind, you go in the Lua event page, you go in the category, and you're going to search for an event that interests you in what you're trying to achieve. So you might need to scroll this list a bunch, read the names, try something interesting, maybe click a random one and see what it does. And when you see it doesn't do what you want, well, you look for another one. In this case, I'm going to give you the answer. We want to search for the onKey string. This is going to trigger when you have pressed a key, and this is going to trigger when you press a key. So we want to trigger when we press a key. So this event fires when we start pressing a key. We can copy this code here and reuse it here. So this has a key parameter. The key parameter is simply an integer, and this integer is associated to a specific key. So let's do a print key this way. For now, we're not going to run this, so I'm going to comment it out, and let's launch the game and see what this does. Okay, welcome back. So in the mods manager, after I've enabled my mod, I've also got a few debug modes which are activated, but in this case, you can simply ignore them and use your mod. Let's create a simple save. Okay, we're in game. So here you have a console, which appears when you have activated the debug mode. If you're curious about the debug mode, you can search for the startup parameters, a Wiki page, and you have a game argument, which is -debug, to launch the game in debug mode. I'm not going to show you how to activate the debug mode in this guide. You can find plenty of guides on this. Okay, so you can see that I'm pressing some keys, and it's printing some integers in the chat. So let's say we want to trigger our code when pressing the T key. Well, we could simply press the T key like this, and you can see that it's the 20, the number 20. And we could simply go back in our code, say if key equal 20, then run the code. But if we do that, like, this is kind of annoying. Well, we have a solution for that. If we go in the keyboard wiki page, the keyboard wiki page allows you to retrieve the numbers of the keys very easily. So to access a key, you simply do keyboard dots and the keyboard entry this way. So let's search for the letter T. So it's written key_T. And this should give us the exact number we're interested in. Let's reload Lua by quitting to the main menu and reopening the save. Now let's press T. It prints, and if I press other keys, nothing prints. So it does exactly what we want to do. Okay, so now let's uncomment this and let's move it here. So if we do that, we're not going to have any feedback of what's actually happening with our code. We can simply do print zombies, and this should print the list of zombies. If we go to the main menu again to reload the Lua and restart the save, and we press the T key, you can see this printed a bunch of stuff in the console, but it's a bit unusable that way. And our goal at the end of the day is to show a text above the head of the zombies. So if we find some zombies here, we want to show text above the head. So I'm going to give you the solution on how to do that. But if you want to do it yourself, you'll have to basically search how to do the things a bit by using the various tools I've shown you until then. So to parse a zombie list this way, on array list, you can do for I equals 0, zombies size, we do -1. We can get a zombie by doing zombie equals zombies, get I, and we can add text above the head of the zombie by doing zombie semicolon line chat, hello world. So this should add text above the head of every zombie if we reload the Lua again. Okay, and if I press over keys, nothing happens. If I press the T key, we got all text above the zombie heads. So don't get too scared about having to learn how to do that. It might sound complicated at first, and to be fair, it is. It's quite fair, like when you're new to all of this, to not know how to do any of this. But if you look for things and you try to search for examples in the game code, if you use the JavaDocs to find out, like for example, get zombie list, you could have found it by simply searching how you can retrieve an ISO zombie class. You have solutions to find the stuff you need. But you can also get help from other modders if you really need it. You can also search for examples inside existing mods, and you can find some documentation on how to do specific stuff in the wiki itself or specific guides. So from here you can do a bunch of stuff with your Lua code. I simply used this event, but maybe there's other stuff that we could use instead than this event. It could have been done on a click of a mouse or every tick when using a vehicle. You can do a bunch more stuff this way. Okay, thank you for watching this video. If you need to get more information, more guides on how to do specific things, you can find more guides on my YouTube channel. And if you need more help, don't hesitate to go read more in depth the various pages that I linked in this guide. To also join the modding Discord if you need more help. You can find the modding wiki by searching for the unofficial modding Discord, the project modding community, and you can find a join link for the Discord here. If you have more technical questions, don't hesitate to ask them there. We have plenty of people that are willing to help new modders to learn how to do things. So I'll tell you, have fun doing testing things on your end, trying to achieve things, to read the game code and learn how any of it works, and goodbye.